We're just getting assembled here, so just bear with us 1 minute while the audience comes in. Great, so let's get started. This is Dr. David Nace, Chief Medical Officer here at Innovacer, and welcome to this webinar, Leveraging Real-World Evidence in Life Sciences, the importance of data curation and enrichment for better patient outcomes. So let me welcome my panelists, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Kelly Zhao. Dr. Zhao is Head of Medical Analytics in Real-World Evidence at Beatrice. Now, many of you may not be familiar with Beatrice, but we'll have Dr. Zhao tell us a little bit about who Beatrice is and what her role is there. Dr. Zhao, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Nace. Glad to be here.
Good. Kelly, I hope you don't mind if I call you Kelly.
Yes.
Awesome. So, you have an amazing background. I mean, you spent many years at Harvard Medical School as an associate professor of statistics. You have a PhD in statistics from the University of Rochester. You've done a lot of work around analytics and the use of data, unstructured data, text analytics, but you also have a personal side in your background in terms of your own interests. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I think it's, part of my background included imaging analysis, particularly medical imaging. So on the side, since I'm interested in unstructured data, I would say just general multimedia. So I do make some paintings, oil paintings, and also used to, when I was in high school, I was the TV producer for a major TV station and wrote stories. And recently at the International Statistical Congress to be held in December, I am the chair of its talent show. So I do enjoy the personal side of, perhaps the audience as well as the professional side.
And then you were with Pfizer for well over a decade. Tell us a little bit about the work you did there and your work as a statistician working in the life science arena.
Yeah, so after academia, I also spent time in finance. That's the other side that, Dr. Nace might be interested. I used to work in finance in London and as an algorithm developer. So we, very happy to talk about data science aspect. But beyond that, in the pharmaceutical industry, I was the outcome statistician, which means, not necessarily for randomized controlled trials, but whenever we have patient-reported outcomes and those very important measurements like surveys to the patients in RCTs, I was the statistical lead. And then I was in the real-world data center of excellence, first as client partner to 2 different business units, including internal medicine and established medicine. And in addition, I became the group lead of methods and algorithms for all business units at Pfizer. So I can talk about perhaps any type of therapeutic areas. But then I was the vice president and head of medical analytics and insights in one of the verticals. That's where this particular vertical became part of this new company called Beatrice after a merger very recently. So overall, within Pfizer, previously there were mainly 3 verticals: the biopharmaceutical group, the consumer health group, and then also the essential health group. And the consumer health group had this joint venture with GSK, whereas we're having a merger with Beatrice. But Pfizer is still the majority stakeholder. So just let you know that not too far yet. So.
Well, what a great background to talk about leveraging what we often talk about, the new gold, the new oil, which is data, and how we might actually start using real-world data and to look at real-world evidence in the life science arena. So let's get started. When we talk about real-world data and real-world evidence, what is it we're talking about?
So this, according to the major professional society ISPOR, there was this, a while ago, there was this article talking about real-world data and real-world evidence. And the conclusion it drew is that we're still quite uncomfortable with the word sort of real world, because as we know before, a lot of times we just call that observational, right? Observational data, observational studies. But the real sort of starting of this terminology came from the 21st Century Cures Act. So the US Congress actually officially defined the term real world evidence. So the FDA, particularly has this real world data, real world evidence site, and it gives the the current sort of definition. Essentially, broadly speaking, real world data are data generated outside RCTs. And then particularly data can be used for many purposes. And of course, on this slide, the data can come from many forms. And as you can imagine, those sources can be in RCTs, but we're focusing on things like non-traditional RCT-based sources. And then in addition, what do we mean by real world evidence? When you have this data and you undergo this analytic process and then really identify, as we probably know, some of the outcomes, and then also these outcomes can also be used for multiple purposes, particularly in general insights. So that's where real world evidence can be generated from the data. So it has to undergo an analytic process.
Lots of interest here. We've talked about this for years. I think we finally might be making some strides. I think for those members of the audience who will be very interested in your perspective here, because your background is so rich, please, for the audience, go into the chat box and enter your questions. I'll be tracking them as we go along, and I'll bring them up as we proceed through the webinar with Dr. Zhao. So awesome. So as I mentioned, the industry has been very interested in this issue of how do you leverage real-world data and start to collect and look at real-world evidence beyond the traditional clinical trial. Look at this dramatic change in this survey to show that interest is finally becoming very important for these organizations. So let's talk about what the opportunities are for real-world evidence. We'll start with clinical trials. How might real-world data really transform the way we think about clinical trials?
Yeah, first of all, most recent industry benchmark study. So over the course of several years, as of 2017, for example, Deloitte has been conducting the biopharmaceutical industry's company uses of real world evidence and then put down which are the current trends, right? So the most recent one nowadays, one of that is really about regulatory purpose, and then also, of course, through different regulatory purposes, RCT is very important. And then for a particular type of optimization of RCT, we can think about, for example, if you want to have a late phase study, how many dosage arms you need? And then is this really necessary to have so many different parallel arms, which can take a long time and be very costly? In addition, is this reasonable to think about flexible dosage? And also, if a particular label has been approved in a particular market or country, can this learning be borrowed in a way for a country where the label has not been approved? And finally, as you know, there are some quite famous examples in terms of label expansion. For example, if you have female breast cancer, can you use that evidence to also be incorporated into expanding to male metastasized breast cancer? And then if you have a product approval for adults, is this possible to think about label expansion to the pediatric patients? So these are the examples about late phase studies. Whereas when you go earlier, right? So real world evidence is so broad and rich. You think about patient characteristics, patient information from biobank, from genomics, from imaging, that's routinely being incorporated in the RCT. But in addition, if you have an early phase study that enrollment is slow and you're getting some obstacle in terms of accrual of patients, can you look into the real world just to see what are the particular sites where patients are being generated from? is there any obstacle in terms of diversity of patient population? And finally, is your protocol too rigid in terms of enrolling patients such that your enrollment becomes too slow? So in terms of this protocol optimization process, end to end, you can definitely look into real evidence. And then finally, back to the late phase one. As you know, historically, observational studies are very well used in terms of post-marketing purposes, and then including confirming real-world evidence results and so on, and then late phase, beyond phase 4 and so on. So, real-world evidence can be useful throughout the entire development cycle.
No, I think this is awesome because we can start to think about addressing the issue that many people have brought up in the past, that clinical trials may not reflect the actual patient population that they'll receive once the drug is released into the market or approved for a particular use. And now we have all these new data sources, and we can start to generate patient information and start to make these trials more reflective of the real world. So I think this is a tremendous move. It's also changed the need for market access. A lot of these new drugs, a lot of money is spent in developing them, and so they end up being sort of approved but used as third line. Might real-world evidence be a way to start showing the value created for the population that's needed for these drugs?
Yeah, so I think in terms of market access, health technology assessment, pricing, reimbursement. Well, first of all, real evidence can be really useful for understanding the healthcare sort of ecosystem and also particularly the insurance market, right? Because claims data really came from just medication fills and pharmacies and medical claims, where you really have a window to the costs that patients have faced, and not only effectiveness. And then also electronic health records and so on. You can see, when patients have some contacts and to the healthcare system. Now, in terms of the uses in this area, that means beyond medical and regulatory, really on the commercial side, you can really think about, particularly value-based contract, where when you have a product on the market, you really have to show in the real world that's being effective, where that is valuable. So I think the key, as Dr. Nace said, is really this understanding of the concept of value. And then in addition, in this, we've also looked into some health technology assessment arena. And, however, that's still mixed, because the receptiveness of the reimbursement authorities, it's still kind of mixed, because they might still want, one, really RCT information. Secondly, meta-analysis. Third one is really cost-effectiveness model. But I think for these assumptions in those models, real-world evidence can also provide some validation of some information. And I would say perhaps it's getting more and more, in terms of the attention of HTA bodies. But however, that concept of value, whether real-world evidence can provide that kind of a really validated information, it's still yet to be seen, and also depends on the data quality.
No, that makes a lot of sense. There's another opportunity, I think, and we've talked about this for many years, the issue of medication adherence. So, I mean, this has been a big challenge for decades, ever since certainly I trained as a physician. How do we think about addressing this issue of poor adherence? You show in a trial where you can actually know the patient's taking medication, and how does that impact in terms of adherence into the real world? How might we look at this as an opportunity?
Yes, in fact, this is really timely. My colleagues and I just not too long ago, a few months ago, just gave a World Congress specialized workshop on adherence in general. So that was a 4-part workshop, and I presented on real-world evidence. First of all, using real-world evidence methodology, that's really important to study really what it means by medication adherence. And not only that, there's also persistence. So these are different. One is in terms of fraction of dose, and the other one is fraction of time on therapy and so on. So these are different statistical quantities. Beyond that, there are other areas. For example, the first one is really during the pandemic, right? So patients, in terms of particularly chronic disease patients, they may not interact with the healthcare system, with their HCPs as frequently. So can we think about innovative ideas such as telemedicine and also internet hospital ideas? And then, of course, online sort of medication delivery, would that increase the adoption of keeping patients being more persistent? And also, when you have sort of a social support net, can your family members and caregivers help you, remind you, and particularly for senior citizens, right? So the second one is really thinking about what are the obstacles for adherence? Why patients are dropping off? Sometimes several months later, they just stop using medications. Are there digital apps? For example, you can look at patients really taking the medicine and ingesting the medicine using some video tracking tools. And finally, you can also look at digital reminding systems where, as you know, pharmacists send these, text messages can remind you to fill your medication. Can this really improve the adherence? So there are many areas where really innovative digital tools can provide some assistance. But statistically, in terms of outcomes, we also need to know, given all these new ways of reminding patients and their caregivers, what this fundamentally changed really the measure, right? However, it seems like there's also this, sometimes there's the virtual reality fatigue, that patients get so many reminders and then they still have the fear to interact, particularly during the COVID. So now that there's the first vaccine being authorized in the UK, is there any way that, this is the new way of doing things, or is it really temporary? So.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And, certainly in this pandemic, we've all learned about connecting with each other, to look at it broadly, through a variety of mechanisms, Zoom and asynchronous. And so I think, that experience could be reflective in addressing many of the issues you just pointed out. I think there's a tremendous opportunity here around understanding and also improving medication adherence and understanding the implications of patients that are not adherent and their drop off from trials. Great example. So this is another holy grail. We often talk about oil being, or data being the new oil. We often talk about the move in life sciences from to precision medicine, meaning finding the right treatment for the right patient, given their genome and their phenotype and their setting, the setting that they live in, and with the right treatment decision. This gets very, very complicated when we think about it, particularly around drug development and doing trials and release. How do we think about how real-world evidence might help us move into this world of precision medicine, and what are some of the issues we need to think about?
Yeah, this is a great slide, for example, that shows the variety of types of really advanced data sources that can provide us. But, I think historically, bioinformatics, has been known, and, there is some really advanced work throughout sort of the last perhaps 10 years or so in terms of examining genomics, examining imaging, and others, and less of social media and so on. But I think nowadays when we talk about real evidence, perhaps it's an opportunity under the 21st Century Cures Act, and also under the regulatory movement to towards more of adoption of such kind of data, is that this is no longer perhaps just bioinformatics, but or even neuroinformatics. Sometimes it's called, like if it's in the brain sort of area. But now it's becoming broader, and there's a whole stop of variety of data sources potentially available. And I think the challenges are sometimes these expertise and also data are siloed. And then secondly, is there a holistic way that we may be able to access, for example, not only claims, but also throughout, going further into electronic medical records, going into these unstructured data. And then I think, as Dr. Nace said, it's really about, right patient, right therapy. What I would say also, in some article that I wrote is that right patient, right medicine, and right timing. Because that's the other aspect, it's the T. It's really about timing, because whether your therapy will be effective also depends on whether it's early enough, early identification of potential patients with those comorbid conditions. And then if you don't treat them early enough, too late, that might be the prognosis might not be as effective. So I think it's very important to utilize all these data sources and really data science, informatics, and other sort of scientific disciplines. So it's a multidisciplinary collaboration as well.
No, I look at this and think about the complexity. I think about this, concept of artificial intelligence being the new future, and I can see right here where AI can play a role in finding this aspect of the right treatment for the right patient at the right time, depending on all these variables, because this is going to be too complicated to figure out in the way we used to do things. Let's check in with the audience around these opportunities and find out what they see as the opportunity. So for you in the audience, if you can go on and take this poll, just pick one of the following. What do you see as the most promising near-term opportunity for real-world evidence in your organization? So while we're taking that poll, Dr. Zhao, there's a couple questions from the audience as you've talked. One is, can you touch a little bit on the sponsor obligations and reporting for adverse events and serious adverse events in terms of real-world evidence studies? And is the sponsor obligated to ask for adverse effects? Dr. Zhao, can you hear me?
Yes. So in terms of this question, it really depends on what type of data sources that you're dealing with. And a lot of times sponsors license the data, so these analyses are retrospective. So, in terms of those type of signals that you mentioned, this may or may not be sort of relevant, right? But however, many type of, particularly for so-called PAS study, post authorization safety studies, these are prospective data collection, and you definitely have the standard operating procedure to report any kind of such signal, safety signal, and so on. But then in terms of the other is really disclosure requirement, right? So there are also standard procedures about those. For example, in terms of some of these post-authorization commitments, these are required in terms of registering those studies. But many times in terms of more of a retrospective, or sometimes there's also the, those studies that may or may not, more like health economics outcomes research studies. But in terms of prospective data collection for regulatory purpose, those type of studies, you may need to register not only US, UK, Japan, China, global, all these different government portals. The other aspect about real world evidence is that there's also something called a pragmatic clinical trial, which is called PCT. And these are hybrid studies where the randomizing agents could be counseling, could be using a new digital tool, maybe using Apple Watch versus no watch. And those types really depends on whether those are in terms of whether you see it more in terms of the RCT framework and versus in terms of non-interventional framework. So it could be hybrid. So my answer is really, it depends.
Great. Well, it looks like the poll is done and we have the results in front of us. What's very interesting is the low percentage of people that saw med adherence, but most people in this audience, saw the kind of split between clinical trials and market access and enabling personalized medicine. What do you think of these results?
Well, I think the set of attendees are spot on. If you look at the 2020 Deloitte survey of major biopharmaceutical companies, the top ones are regulatory uses such as RCT, and also include the top, probably the second top or so. That's the really the value-based contract, and then third is comparative effectiveness research. I can say that they gave a total of over 10 different types of uses. And here, this is not being included, for example, business development, right? When you think about acquiring a target molecule, you need to look into some of the due diligence analyses, and then personalized medicine and so on. I would say all these are being used, but I would say you're pretty much spot on based on the pharmaceutical surveys.
And the way I would look at it is there's lots of opportunities, right, for real world evidence. So this is great. Now, there's lots of opportunities, but there's also lots of challenges. So let's talk about this issue because we are talking about data. So, one of the questions that comes up many times when you look at all these data sources, paid claims, laboratory data, EHR data, real world data, like social determinants, like very diverse. What do you see as the challenges in quality of data?
So talking about the quality of data, I would say, for example, the success story of Flatiron is really that it looked at regulatory grade and it's very focused on oncology. So I think, and also the adjudication process. But when you think about diverse data sources, not even getting into unstructured data, just structured data alone, these are mainly from billing and from the actual patient visits, right? So I would say these are not even sort of the RCT quality. It's really just some of the potential errors. What I've seen, for example, a bit of an innocent error is that you look at the BMI and if you look at some European data source, sometimes the reported value did not make sense. The reason is whether you measure the height in terms of meter versus centimeter. That would need to be sort of standardized in a way, but do you go back and correct those or do you just omit them? So that's really the challenging aspect. And statistically, the algorithm is that, in RCT, you have many ways of looking at imputing the data, and you look at very careful about dropout mechanism, missing mechanism. But I think in real world data, you sit back and say, I'm really reassured that's large sample size, and I just omit some of the unavailable data and, for one of the variables and so on. Well, that's not a very good practice. The reason is that it's, unless these are missing at random, you're really, discarding potential valuable information where that could be non-adherence. That's the reason, right? Why it's missing. So I would say, for real world evidence, you really need to think about, not only ensuring data can be captured as comprehensively as possible, but in the real world. And also in terms of data science, you can also explore in terms of, the front. It's really about data processing and also statistically, what are the sound mechanisms and sensitivity analyses and robustness check using multiple data sources in parallel. And also here it says, not only diversity, some variable is not available, such as ethnicity and race. And what do you do? And then some do not cover uninsured patients or patients out of pocket.
Yes, I was, just talking to a client yesterday because we monitor the quality of the data on a regular basis, and they were talking about some of the data from that payer is lagged by 4 to 6 months. Other data is real time. The data has different sort of data set. There's in the structured data, there's fields that are missing. Some of the data doesn't make sense. They have to have a way to monitor for that quality, which we do. Obviously, if you have the height coming in, even in feet, if it's a 40-foot person, that's not correct. So being able to identify errors in data as well. So much here around the quality of data. And then also there's so many different sources of data and they sit in different silos, often with different coding schemas. This is a tremendous amount of diversity of data sources here. How do we make sense of this, Dr. Zhao?
Well, there are two challenges. One is really the lack of right data, because for one way or the other, any sponsor, regardless of what size, typically may not be able to really deal with all these comprehensive data sources. And one other reason is that it's really data strategy. If you're working on certain therapeutic areas, there are other databases that could be really potentially useful, but is this really cost effective for the sponsor to license them all? So that's the issue. The second one is that the data sizes, the database sizes are really large and very diverse. And the question is that if you are lucky enough to get multiple data sources, would you be able to get comprehensive information? And one challenge is really HIPAA. You cannot, some require that you cannot really link the data, just, and the other one is that data crossing the border, you get into those data regulation, data flow challenge. So really it's a question that I listened to the FDA's sort of workshop and also the National Academy of Medicine in terms of the grand round. I think some of the suggestions are thinking about parallel analysis as if that's a meta-analysis. Then you get the results and see, just like how you have those forest plots, and just to see if your results can hold. But of course, you need to understand for each database, the patient sources and their characteristics could be somewhat different.
Yeah, I'm just, it's mesmerizing sometimes to think about all these different sources and how they're all coded differently or stored differently. Certainly, this is an area that we've had a lot of experience here in my organization of being able to access data from all these sources. And I think to your point, it's not just linking them, but making sure that they're available in a HIPAA compliant way, as well as other regulatory. So there's lots of challenges here that need to get tackled. And then we've been talking about relatively structured data. You've mentioned unstructured data in your experience in the past. What do you think the value in leveraging clinical notes that are attached to laboratory reports? Is there value there, and how much predictive value might that give us when it comes to clinical research?
I think it depends on the which side of the organization is really leveraging a broad spectrum of real world evidence. I think generally when we think about more like health economics outcomes research, you do not really see the raw unstructured data. So it's very challenging to biopharmaceutical companies unless they have a niche sort of collaboration. For example, raw notes the insurers might have, but they will give you summarized variables. These are called NLP terms, natural language process terms. And you can request for these and they'll give you, translate them into structured data. It could be just how, you have yes, no, you have certain values extracted from the notes. So you, because of HIPAA, because of safety reporting, requirements, I think it may not be possible for you just deal with the actual raw notes. Now, for some of these bioinformatics part of the business, they are able to look at such kind of information, maybe, for example, medical images, through some collaboration. But in terms of those, I would say, can they, in the early development, early enough to also be able to look at later phase use of data, for example, a product that's being on the market, or even a similar product or class of products. So I would say that, if we could have more of a full spectrum of technology, a really standardized way of looking such kind of data, and then we have an end-to-end really approach to understanding data much better for insights, I think that would be really a plus.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And it's funny, I had experience, my training is at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, at work with the health plan as we built that over the years. And so we were doing lots and lots of layers of analytics to some very complicated data sources, trying to predict who, when they left the hospital, might be readmitted. What came up when we looked at the unstructured data was it was the actual prescription of a particular type of appliance when we left that had the highest, when they left the hospital, that had the highest predictive value. No one would have ever thought about that nor found that information out without the unstructured note. And it's not something that one would have thought of, but it was highly predictive. So, you can discover so much once you start to access these notes that's not just available in the structured data that's available in all these silos. And then the other issue is, and I think you and I were talking about this just before the webinar, we have data scientists here, and lots of reports are getting access to data and being able to understand that data and find things in the data tends to be something people spend a lot of time on. Isn't this a challenge for us?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is the unsung hero that typically we do not see when we get the results and insights. I think actually in the very first 2017 Deloitte survey about benchmarks of real world evidence, really important recommendation is about talent. So, we really need to have a variety of skill sets in terms of leveraging such kind of data. And I think historically, because of different stages and different phases of RCTs, the talents typically are in clusters. I would not say really silos, but really in terms of a relayed approach. But I think in terms of using this variety of data sources, it's important not only to think about data scientists, but also traditional RCT type of skill set. For example, specified protocol and the statistical analysis plan, which data scientists might say, I really want to look at signals, right? I really want to do, exploratory data analysis and machine learning and so on. So it's like frustrating that you need to fit into this rigid sort of RCT framework. And then on top of that, for medical professionals, they, not only they, but also myself included, we also need to think about when we speak the language of data scientists, they give us those results. What exactly do we mean in terms of, the impact, and what are the key insights? How do you summarize use cases when, sort of a non-technical decision maker, or even the audience, or even patients, caregivers can understand? So I would say, this is not as simple as just process the data and get the insights, but really conveying the message to lead, to have a conversation, and then also for peer review publication, and then also think about engagement to the stakeholders.
No, I think that's one of the things we often think about here at Innovaccer is how do you bring that data, curate it, and harmonize it, enhance it so that the search becomes much easier, and so that data scientists don't have to spend all that time looking for data or kind of what we often call wrangling the data from different sources. A question from the audience that relates here, when we talk about real world data, it's, and I love the way this was phrased by the questioner, it's classically the exhaust, the result of, as a car exhaust, it's classically the exhaust of the clinical process, which is highly variable depending on the provider. What notes do they enter? How do they think about it? What processes do they follow? It's not as well controlled as in clinical trials or other protocol-driven studies. How should we think about that difference when we think about protocol-driven studies versus real-world evidence?
Well, you need to read this article in New Yorker, and Atul wrote an article called Why Doctors Hate Computers. So that's quite insightful. For example, traditionally, if you have this primary care doctor you trust and you like to have a conversation, the beauty of that is this doctor will capture that in a very well-trained manner in terms of the notes. But nowadays, lot of times you go see your doctor for your annual checkup, and they'll have standardized computer sort of forms to fill out. They're just doing multiple choices. That's when you say that I wish this doctor and myself as a patient can have a face-to-face conversation, right? And I think that rapport sometimes gets lost when you standardize too much. And secondly, if you're busy taking the notes, you really lose the opportunity to really ask the right questions. So, Atul actually said that there's also potential solution like having a scriber, where the scriber can listen on to the conversation and also provide some notes. But that also gets to the privacy question, right? So I would say, nowadays it's really on the verge of technology that captures standardized information, so you can really have a better quality of data. But at the same time, you also need to think about human side. It's really patient-centric approach that you cannot just have everything in terms of multiple choices. You still need to have a doctor-patient relationship. And I think that for RCTs, these are very well standardized, but that's the also one limitation of the RCT, which is, that may or may not reflect a broader spectrum of patients.
Well, speaking of multiple choice, let's go back and check in with our audience about all of these challenges we talked about in having an effective real-world evidence program and strategy. So please, audience, please go in and go ahead and select all of the, not just one, select one or more of the following that may be the challenges that you're experiencing today in your work in having a really effective real-world evidence program. So while the audience is taking this poll, there's a couple questions that have come up in the chat box about quality of data. For instance, how do you control the quality to convert into evidence? And how do you tier the data quality? So how do you control the quality to convert the evidence at a particular point of interest, like drug effectiveness? And then how do you tier? How do you think about tiers of data quality? Do you have some insights you can share here about quality of data?
Yeah. So, remember we also talked about reporting the safety signal. So let me just continue in terms of two types of data. One is really prospective data collection, and the other one is their data already exists as retrospective. What can you do in terms of that quality? But in terms of the first one, I would say there are really good practices. So if you think about perhaps pragmatic clinical trial, that's a hybrid between RCT and non-interventional studies. And then if you also think about some of the survey studies, prospective data collection, you can really have very good practice in terms of specifying, all these requirements. And so in fact, AHRQ had this guidance in terms of how do you have high quality protocol development for observational studies used for comparative effectiveness research. So there are some really useful tips and also checklists that you can use, and these need to be well specified in advance. And before you even start collecting the data, you need to think about all these different details in terms of different investigators' expertise. Now, in terms of retrospective data, that's harder because they already exist. And then, as Dr. Nace said, looking for the right data that are already there. And of course, when we say retrospective data, we're not just talking about just a one-off data cut, right? So the data can be occurring in the past, but for regulatory purposes, as you mentioned, RCT is important. To support RCT is very important. We still need the data, quote unquote, to be live. But you establish your algorithms based on data occurring in the past. For that, there are a variety of data science and statistical tools that you can use to really do thorough understanding and the check of the data, the missing data pattern, check of the analytic algorithms, check the sensitivity analysis, check different modeling assumptions. So, and also, really use inclusion, exclusion criteria to really focus on the data that really can answer your question.
No, that makes sense. And it looks like we have the results up here. Very interesting. Inability to efficiently leverage valuable unstructured data came out first, and then lack of holistic longitudinal data. What do you think about these results?
Well, first of all, when you see these percentages, these are all quite high. So since it's multiple answers being allowed, right? So my first impression is that there are problems in every of these areas. And I would say for unstructured data, that also gets to the siloed issue, because when you think about talking about the value proposition and then value-based contracts, typically that side of the business may not get to the early sort of laboratory development where typically they get more interaction with unstructured data. So if we can have a good sort of collaboration such that the early development, like proof of concept studies and the phase 1 studies, they can understand how the data are going to be used in terms of evidence and reimbursement. That would be really wonderful for them to think about, utilizing those data and leverage the information, and it's vice versa. It's the same thing. But in terms of the unstructured data analysis, also needs a very specialized sort of expertise, and sometimes it's quite tedious that the software tools they would like to choose. And I think Dr. Nace can talk more about more of a holistic approach to data. And the other ones, longitudinal data, one thing that occurs very frequently is really survey, right? So it's one-off cross-sectional. And also when you have those health economics outcomes research study, it's a one-off data cut. So really we need to have more of a comprehensive data where the right timing, as I mentioned, will be important, because you need to monitor the patient progress. So it's not just one time in the past, but really continuously having the live data. And just these are the top 2, but other ones, they're pretty much really straightforward, right? It's about your organization and those solutions. So I would say having the really discussion about data strategy, what data to be useful, and what kind of data that you can afford, and how do you warehouse the data? Do you have this capability, or does the data source provider have this cloud solution? These are all these questions with IT, BT, and also the data scientists,
No,
and also the users.
No, lots of challenges. And I think as we move into the new world beyond like data warehouses and silos, the issue of cloud, I think you brought up, which is very important. This is a little representation of how we view our work around bringing data together from all these different sources and having them available in the cloud. And then all the things we talked about. How do you not only unify the data, but manage the high quality of the data on an ongoing basis as that data is flowing in, and then be able to democratize access to that data in a private and secure way. So I think, many of the folks who are more IT and data oriented read the reports from Gartner that look at the field. Gartner often talks about the real secret sauce, if you will, behind this is the issue of data curation and ingestion and enhancement. And so having this ability to ingest data from multiple sources in real time, having the ability to normalize it, put it into a unified record to address all that differences in the way data is entered, being able to identify the same patient, and then make that available in a private and secure way, either HIPAA compliant or the use for real world use, is very important as we move into this new world. And there's so much other future data sources, as you can see here, that we're going to have to start tapping into to understand this as we start looking at real world data. This seems to provide some hope, this approach, I think, Dr. Zhao, to really starting to help these organizations address all those challenges that we just went through. Wouldn't you think so?
Yeah, I would say, based on that, there are a couple of really good advantages. One is really the regulation, the data flow regulation and protecting patient privacy. Shipping data around is risky, no matter if it's de-identified data, it's really individual patient level data. And secondly, it's the capability of data storage, right? So that adds IT cost. And thirdly, if you have multiple data sources, is there any standard way such as OMOP to really identify, in terms of identifying the right coding, in terms of, in terms of diagnosis, drug, therapy, and so on. So, and then finally, there's a fast turnaround of, really cohort building, subsetting the data, and have visualization. So I would say, this approach is really useful rather than let's get the raw data and think about solution.
And I think, we have obviously, as you can see in this platform, and from your experience with us, is we've often used this platform historically to help health systems and health plans work together to manage the outcomes, manage their patients, identify high-risk patients. But in doing so, we've collected all this data and continue to collect it in real time, and then use machine learning and artificial intelligence to ingest it, manage the quality, make it available. Now, as we've moved into life science, we realize we have a bit of a liquid gold, if you will, going back to that oil, that the new oil that data represents, to really help life science organizations tap into that in a private and secure way that addresses the issue of de-identification, HIPAA requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So, one of the questions that have come up in the audience is, how do you think, Dr. Zhao, and your experience, your knowledge about what we're doing here, how do you think about this issue of normal or de-identification and insurance of, that the data is being used in a HIPAA compliant way?
Yeah, I think typically from my experience, it's really at the data source provider. So when we already access the data, these are de-identified. So I think, those insurers or data, I would say, data aggregator will really think about these questions. And then the other thing I want to say is that, in the past, when I worked in radiological imaging, there are some algorithms. For example, if you look at the brain scan, if you look at multiple slices, you can actually look at the facial feature and positively identify the patient, even though the actual image does not have the identifying information. We developed with, at that time, with UCLA, this algorithm called skull stripping. It's like, how do you omit part of your brain imaging data such that you have this facial being stripped so you cannot identify the patients. So there are many innovative ways of looking at the identification. The other thing is the challenge is that you want to have a one-stop shop of linked data in terms of EHR, in terms of claims and so on, but you don't have the actual tokenization to identify from one patient to another one, whether it's a probabilistic linkage, whether it's the direct linkage. There are lots of sort of scientific sort of basis to that. One other note I want to say is that a platform is really useful, end to end, and it's really straightforward. But since the audience talked about importance of using real world data for, for RCT purpose, different purposes, is that one challenge is that if a regulator wants to audit the codes and really want to say, whether your analyses can be replicated. I think the challenge of the data science of a platform is that sometimes I have really useful information, but can I really look at every step of the actually coding, object-oriented or either line coding? You really look at them and do the Q quality check. And then at the same time, you also need to see the algorithms rather than this black box based sort of machine learning. So I think that gets to the more of a, RCT framework where sponsor typically, has that raw data at hand, whereas nowadays sponsors do not own the data, but really license sort of in a way find really the results and the insights.
And that one-stop shop and the ability to have that linkage already done and manage the quality is really what we're excited about, working with different life science companies to help to tackle these problems. It really goes back to what our core value proposition is here that we've learned. It's how do you think about data curation and enrichment as the core of being able to provide that one-stop shop and that high-quality data-linked access to be able to look at this. And this is just a circle demonstrating continuous quality monitoring, because this is real-world evidence. It's coming in all the time, rather than going and purchasing sets of data that are older from different sources. This really is a new world, I think, for us. How do you catalog it? How do you enrich it? How do you make sure that you can start to look at the patient journey, say within a clinical trial, and start to understand that? Just so much opportunity here for a data activation platform. So let's kind of summarize this. This has been a great hour. I've learned a lot. I really appreciated all the input you've had. But as we move into this new world for life sciences in particular, and thinking about the use of real world data to start moving into real world evidence and all the different aspects we talked about, you know, the opportunities we have around clinical trials, market access, medication adherence, precision medicine, the whole new world of precision medicine. Sounds like digital transformation efforts will fail unless you really have an underlying platform, a one-stop shop, as you mentioned, that really starts to connect them. What do you see the future for life science organizations as they think about this?
Yeah, and I think, you know, there are certain trends, but first one is real-world evidence is becoming more widely known, and the regulators are paying more attention to them. So I would say all these different aspects and the advantages of having this type of platform will be very useful going into the future.
Great. Well, this has been a real joy. You know, I particularly enjoyed learning about your background. It's certainly extraordinary. I mean, the statistical background, the way you've given back through the various societies in the areas that you've chaired or committed your time to, and then also the work you're doing with this new organization in partnership, you know, through Beatrice. And then more importantly, the humane aspect of you as a person. So we will send out this slide deck. We'll send out a link to you. I would advise you to go and look at the LinkedIn profile for Dr. Zhao. I think it's an extraordinary background you have, and particularly enjoy all the diverse background and talents you have around photography and painting, and your interest in certain music and TV production, and bringing that to help people enjoy their life in addition to learning how to enhance the world of life sciences using real world data. Thank you so much for participating, Dr. Zhao.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Nace. And I would say enjoy the real world. And I'm so glad to be connected with you virtually.
Absolutely. And thank you, audience, for coming. This has been an extraordinary webinar, and we will look forward to future contact with you all.
Thank you.
So with that, this concludes the webinar. And again, thank you again, Dr. Zhao.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.